I've lived in this old apartment for years. It's nothing special. Peeling wallpaper, creaky floors, the scent of dust permanently settled in the walls. But it's home. And across the street, in a building just as old as mine, there's always been a single light in one of the windows. Apartment 303. An old man lived there. I never knew his name. No one did. The neighbors whispered about him, but never with any real concern. Just the kind of hushed curiosity reserved for urban legends. No one had ever seen him leave the apartment. No visitors.
No deliveries.
Just that dim, flickering light in his window at night. At first, I didn't care. People have their own lives, their own routines. But things changed. It started with the sounds. I live alone, and my door is always locked. But late at night, just as I was dozing off, I heard footsteps inside my apartment. Slow, deliberate, a dragging sound, like someone shuffling their feet across the wooden floor. I held my breath, straining to listen. My heart pounded in my ears. I reached for my phone, turned on the flashlight, and scanned the room. Nothing. Everything was as I left it. The locks were secure. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was my upstairs neighbor moving around. I told myself that until it happened again. And again. Then came the peephole. One night, as I was about to sleep, a strange feeling crept up my spine. The undeniable sensation of being watched. I got up and crept to the door, pressing my eye against the peephole. A light, dim, pulsing, as if someone was standing right outside my door holding up a flashlight. I hesitated. My fingers hovered over the lock. Finally, I took a deep breath and swung the door open. Nothing. Just the empty hallway, stretching into darkness. But the smell, a stale, rotten scent lingered, like something long dead. I slammed the door shut. I didn't sleep that night. Then came the worst of it. One evening, after a long shift at work, I trudged up the stairs to my apartment. The hallway was dim, the flickering bulbs casting eerie shadows. As I reached my door, I felt it again. That unsettling feeling, the air thick with something I couldn't describe. I turned the key and pushed the door open. And there, standing in the middle of my apartment, was the old man from across the street. He was tall, unnaturally thin, his skin gray and sagging. His eyes were sunken, deep pits of darkness that seemed to swallow the dim light of my lamp. His mouth hung slightly open, lips cracked and dry. I couldn't move. The door was still open behind me. I could turn, run, call for help. But my body was frozen in place, as if the air itself had turned to cement around me. The old man didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stared at me. And then, in the span of a blink, he was gone. Vanished. I stumbled back, gasping, my heart racing. My apartment was empty. The doors and windows were locked, just as I had left them. Had I imagined it? No. The air still carried that same rancid smell. And on the floor, where he had been standing, were damp footprints, leading nowhere. That night I barely slept. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them rational. I needed answers. The next morning, I made my way to the building across the street. The old man's apartment, 303. I had never been inside. No one had. But what I found froze the blood in my veins. Apartment 303 had been sealed shut with caution tape. The door was covered in dust, untouched for ages. A paper was taped to the front, an official notice. The old man who lived there had been dead for over a year. I stood there, staring at the notice on the door of apartment 303. My mind refused to accept what I was seeing. Deceased. Date of death. 1 year ago. I read it over and over, my pulse hammering in my ears. The man I had seen in my apartment last night, the man I had seen standing right in front of me, had been dead for a year. I backed away from the door, suddenly feeling lightheaded. The hallway of the old building stretched out on either side, silent and empty. Dust hung in the air like a thick fog, undisturbed by time. This was impossible. I needed proof. I needed to talk to someone. Anyone. I hurried downstairs, my footsteps echoing on the creaky wooden steps. The front desk of the building was empty, but a small office was tucked in the corner. The door was ajar, revealing an older woman inside. She was hunched over a stack of papers, her glasses perched at the tip of her nose. "Excuse me," I said, my voice unsteady. She looked up, startled. I live across the street. I wanted to ask about apartment 303. Her expression darkened instantly. She adjusted her glasses and shook her head. 303? She repeated, her voice laced with discomfort. "Why are you asking about that place?" I hesitated. If I told her the truth, she'd think I was insane. I used to see the old man who lived there," I said carefully. "But I just noticed the apartment has been sealed. I didn't know he had passed away." The woman exhaled slowly, rubbing her temples. "That apartment's been empty for a long time," she said. "The old tenant, Mr. Petrov, he died in there, alone." A cold chill settled in my stomach. "How?" I asked. She looked at me carefully, as if debating whether to tell me. "Heart failure," she said finally. But the strange thing was, no one found him for weeks. He had no family, no friends. The smell was what gave it away. The neighbors complained about the stench seeping through the walls. When they finally checked inside, he was just there, sitting in his chair by the window, as if he had been waiting for something. I swallowed hard. I had seen him, standing in my apartment, staring at me. I forced myself to keep my voice steady. "And since then, no one else has lived there?" "No," the woman shook her head firmly. "That place is cursed. Some of the residents say they still hear noises coming from inside at night. Footsteps, scratching. But there's nothing there." I couldn't listen anymore. I muttered a quick thank you and left the building, my mind racing. I walked back to my apartment, every step feeling heavier than the last. The daylight did little to chase away the chill crawling under my skin. I had to know the truth. That night, as darkness settled over the city, I sat by my window, staring at apartment 303. The light was off. The whole place was dark and lifeless, just as it should be. But at exactly 3:03 a.m., something changed. A faint glow flickered to life in the window of apartment 303. I held my breath. A shadow moved behind the glass. I could barely make it out, but it was there, tall and thin, shifting in the dim light. And then it turned toward me. Even from across the street, I felt its gaze lock onto mine. A deep, hollow stare. And then, a knock. I whipped around, my heart in my throat. The sound echoed through my apartment. Someone was at my door. Slow, rhythmic. 3 knocks. I forced myself to stand. My legs felt like lead as I crept to the peephole. My breath caught in my throat. A light, just like before. Flickering, pulsing. As if something was standing just on the other side. I reached for the lock. My fingers trembled. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to stop, to not open the door. But I had to know. I turned the lock and pulled the door open. Nothing. The hallway was empty. But the smell was there. That same rancid, rotting scent. Stronger this time. And then I saw them. Footprints. Faint, damp imprints on the wooden floor, leading from my door, straight into my apartment. I wasn't alone. The footprints trailed into my apartment. Dark, wet imprints against the wooden floor. My throat tightened as my eyes followed them. One step after another, leading past my kitchen, past my living room, into my bedroom. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to leave, to never come back. But my body moved on its own. My hand gripped the doorframe as I stepped inside, my breath shallow, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. The air in my bedroom was thick, heavy. The stench of decay clung to every breath I took. I reached for the light switch. My fingers barely brushed it when, click, the bulb flickered and died. I froze. And then, the closet door creaked open. I stopped breathing. It was pitch dark, but I could hear something inside. Faint, rasping inhale. The sound of dry lungs struggling to pull in air. I took a step back, my hands shaking. The darkness inside the closet seemed alive. Shifting. Waiting. Then I saw them. eyes, deep, sunken pits of nothingness, reflecting what little light remained in the room. And below them, a mouth that barely seemed human, gaping, unmoving, lips cracked and dry. The old man. He was inside my closet. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. The crash shattered the silence, and suddenly the figure in the darkness moved. Fast. I didn't see how, but he was closer. I ran. I didn't stop to grab my phone. I didn't stop to lock the door behind me. I just ran down the hall out of my building, into the cold night air. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the block. My breath came in ragged gasps. My body was shaking uncontrollably. It wasn't possible. None of this was possible. I turned, looking back at my apartment window. The lights were still off. Everything looked normal. But across the street, apartment 303, the dim glow was still there. And in the window, just barely visible against the flickering light, was a figure. Watching me. I had to get help. I couldn't go back to my apartment. Not yet. So I did the only thing I could think of. I found the old woman from the office. She was still there, sorting papers, as if she never left. When she saw me, her face darkened. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she muttered. I didn't know how to respond to that. "Something's in my apartment," I said. My voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Something from 303. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. She exhaled, shaking her head. "You shouldn't have looked at him." My blood ran cold. "What?" She motioned for me to sit, but I couldn't. "There's something you need to understand," she said. "Mr. Petrov wasn't just some lonely old man. He watched. That's all he ever did. He sat in that chair, staring out the window, watching the street, watching the people across from him, watching you." I felt a deep, nauseating chill settle in my stomach. She continued, her voice lower now. "The day he died, no one noticed. Not at first. He was just sitting there in his chair like he always did. Even as his body rotted, he kept staring out that window. My mind raced. But I saw him, in my apartment." She nodded as if she already knew. "He's still watching," she said. "And now he's watching you." I felt sick. "What does he want?" The woman hesitated. "I don't know. No one does. But the ones he fixates on, they don't last long." My mouth went dry. I had to go back. I had to end this. I don't know what I was thinking when I walked back into my apartment. Maybe I had convinced myself it was all in my head. Maybe I just wanted to prove I wasn't losing my mind. The air inside was still, cold. I walked into my bedroom. The closet door was open, but it was empty. The footprints had vanished. I exhaled shakily. Maybe it was over. Maybe it had all been. Knock, knock, knock. The sound echoed through the apartment. I turned toward the door. Knock, knock, knock. Slow, rhythmic. I stepped forward, heart pounding. I already knew what I would see. I pressed my eye to the peephole. A dim, flickering glow. And beyond it, the old man, standing on the other side, waiting. I backed away. The air in the apartment grew thick, heavy with the scent of rot. The knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent. Then, I heard something else. Something inside my apartment. The slow, deliberate drag of footsteps on wood. Coming from behind me. I turned. The closet door was open again. And inside, the darkness shifted. The old man was already here. Couldn't breathe. The knocking on the door grew louder. More frantic. But it didn't matter anymore. Because he was already inside. The old man stood in my closet. Hunched and impossibly still. His hollow eyes bored into mine. Unblinking, unseeing. But somehow I knew he knew I was looking back. I stepped backward. My body trembling. The air smelled thick with rot, damp and suffocating. The knocking on the door stopped. A silence fell over the apartment. And then, the old man moved. Not like a normal person. Not like anything human. His body jerked. His limbs twitching unnaturally. As if he were struggling to remember how to walk. He took one slow, dragging step forward. His lips parted slightly, and a sound. Something between a wheeze and a whisper slipped out. I stumbled back, my legs barely carrying me. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out, but I was frozen in place. The old man took another step, and another, and then he lunged. I don't remember making the decision to move. My body reacted on its own, throwing me backward into the hallway. I scrambled to my feet and ran, slamming into the front door, yanking it open so hard it nearly ripped off its hinges. I stumbled out into the hall, gasping for air. But when I turned around, the apartment was empty.
No footprints. No smell.
No flickering light. Just silence. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Every shadow in my apartment felt wrong. The air felt thick, as if something unseen was still watching me. I packed a bag before the sun even rose. I wasn't staying here, but before I left, I needed to check. I crossed the street and made my way back to the old woman at the front desk. When she saw me, she sighed, as if she already knew why I was there. "He came to you, didn't he?" she murmured. I swallowed hard, nodding. "Why?" My voice was hoarse. "Why me?" she sighed, rubbing her temple. "Because you noticed him," she said. "Because you looked back."
Is there here?
She met my gaze, her face grim. Most people ignore him. They see the apartment, they feel something is off, but they move on. They don't look at the window. They don't check the peephole. But you did. I felt sick. "He fixates on the ones who see him," she continued. "And once he does, he doesn't let go." I clenched my fists. "Then what do I do?" She hesitated. "Leave," she said finally. "Don't come back. Don't even think about this place. And whatever you do," her eyes darkened, "never look at apartment 303 again." I didn't need to be told twice. I left that day, packed whatever I could carry and moved across the city. I didn't tell anyone why. I didn't tell anyone about the old man, about the smell, about the thing that had been in my apartment. I tried to forget, and for a while I thought I had. But sometimes late at night I feel it again. That sensation, like I'm being watched. And when I walk past a window, my reflection flickering in the glass, I swear, just for a second, I see him, standing in the distance, watching, waiting, for me to look back. When I moved into my new apartment, I thought I had found the perfect place. It was cheap, quiet, and in a decent neighborhood. But there was one rule, a simple one. Never go down to the basement at night. The landlord mentioned it casually, almost as a joke, when handing me the keys. The neighbors, too. Whenever the topic came up, their smiles faded, their voices dropped. I thought it was just some old superstition. Maybe they had problems with rats, or maybe the building's foundation was unstable. Either way, I didn't care. I had no reason to go down there, until I did. And now I wish I had listened. It started on my second night. I got home late from work, exhausted, ready to collapse into bed. But just as I was about to sleep, I heard it, a low, dragging sound, coming from the basement. It wasn't just some random noise, pipes settling, or wind shifting the old walls. It was deliberate, rhythmic, a slow, scraping thud-thud against the basement door. First, I ignored it. I put in my earbuds, turned up the volume, and forced myself to sleep. But every night after that, it got worse. Sometimes it sounded like something scratching against the wood. Other times, a faint whisper, too muffled to understand. Then one night I heard something new, a groan, low, pained, like someone was trapped down there. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to check. That night, just past midnight, I crept down the stairs toward the basement. The building was silent. Everyone else was asleep. As I reached the bottom, the air grew thick, damp, stale, carrying a faint metallic scent. The basement door loomed ahead, an old wooden thing reinforced with a heavy iron lock. But here's the thing. It wasn't locked. The padlock hung loose, unlatched, as if someone had already been down there. I hesitated, my fingers grazing the door handle. A deep unease curled in my stomach. Then, thump, a sudden, heavy knock from the other side. I jumped back, heart hammering. Silence. Then, thump, thump, louder this time, more urgent. I should have run, but something compelled me to move. I reached out, slowly, carefully, and pushed the door open. The hinges creaked. A stale gust of air rushed past me. Inside, the basement was pitch black. I pulled out my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating cracked concrete walls, old wooden beams, and dust swirling in the stale air. And then I saw it. An old, dirty mattress against the far wall. Chains bolted into the concrete, and deep scratches on the floor, leading to the stairs, like someone had been dragged back down. A chill crawled up my spine. I turned to leave, and froze. The door to the apartment across from mine was open, and my neighbor was standing there, watching me. His face was pale, his eyes wide and sunken. He shook his head, slowly, almost sadly. Then, in a whisper barely louder than breath, he asked, "You didn't go in there, did you?" My neighbor's voice was barely more than a whisper, but it sliced through the thick, stale air like a blade. "You didn't go in there, did you?" I didn't answer, couldn't. His eyes darted past me to the open basement door. His expression darkened. Then, without another word, he grabbed my wrist, pulling me back toward the stairs. "We need to go. Now." Something about the way he said it, low, urgent, made my blood run cold. I followed him without question. Back in my apartment, my neighbor locked the door behind us. I finally found my voice. "What the hell was that?" He didn't answer at first. He just stood there, breathing heavily, his gaze distant. Then, slowly, he turned to me. "You should leave this building." I stared at him. "What? Why?" He exhaled shakily. "Because now it knows you." I wanted to laugh, to tell him he was crazy, but something in his face, something broken, stopped me. I swallowed hard. "What is it?" He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "A long time ago, before this place was apartments, it was something else. A hospital, I think. Maybe a shelter. The basement. That's where they kept the ones they didn't want to deal with." A cold, sick feeling settled in my stomach. "The ones they locked away," he continued. "They weren't just abandoned. They were forgotten, starved, left in the dark." He swallowed hard. "Some say they never left." I shook my head. "That's just a story." He didn't blink. "Then explain the sounds, the scratches, the chains." I had no answer. He took a step closer. "People who go down there, they don't come back the same, if they come back at all." I thought of the drag marks on the floor, the mattress, the knocking from the other side of the door. A cold shiver ran through me. My neighbor grabbed my arm. His grip was tight. "If you hear it again," he said, voice low and serious, "do not open the door." That night I barely slept. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my neighbor had just spooked me. But deep down I knew better. I felt it, the heaviness in the air, the way my skin crawled, as if unseen eyes were fixed on me. At exactly 3 a.m., I heard it. The first knock, soft, slow, then another, and another, a rhythmic thump 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 against the basement door. I buried my face in my pillow, my body rigid with fear. Then, a new sound, not knocking, something else, a click, the unmistakable sound of a door unlocking. My breath hitched. I sat up, heart racing. That door was supposed to be locked. I waited, straining to hear. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a single, dragging footstep, coming up the basement stairs. I scrambled out of bed, reaching for my phone, my hands shaking. Another step, then another, and then, a slow, heavy breath, right outside my apartment door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. And then, knock, knock, knock. I gripped my phone so hard my knuckles turned white. My neighbor's voice echoed in my mind. "If you hear it again, do not open the door." I squeezed my eyes shut, and waited. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped. Then, a long, slow scrape as something dragged itself back down the stairs. The door clicked shut, and the building fell silent once more. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, but one thing was clear. Whatever was down there, it wasn't finished with me yet. I didn't sleep. Couldn't. Even after the knocking stopped, even after whatever was out there dragged itself back down the stairs. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my ears straining for the slightest sound. Morning eventually came, but the daylight did nothing to push away the unease coiled deep in my chest. I needed answers. I needed to know what was down there. I found my neighbor later that afternoon, standing outside the building, smoking. His hands trembled as he lit his cigarette. "You heard it again, didn't you?" he muttered without looking at me. I nodded. He took a slow drag before speaking. "I told you not to open the door." "I didn't," I said. "But something else did." He stiffened. I continued, lowering my voice. "I heard it come up the stairs. I heard it breathing outside my door." His jaw clenched. He threw the cigarette to the ground and crushed it under his foot. "I need to know what's going on," I pressed. "What is this place?" He sighed, rubbing his temples. Then finally he spoke. "This building used to be a hospital," he said. "Not a real one. More like a place where they sent people when they didn't know what else to do with them." My stomach twisted. The basement was where they kept the worst cases. The ones no one wanted to see. Some of them were sick. Some of them were violent. Some of them were just forgotten. I swallowed hard. "And the sounds? The knocking?" His expression darkened. "Some say they're still down there. That the ones who died in the dark never really left." I felt a cold sweat break out along my back. "But there's something worse." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Sometimes someone answers the knocking." I shuddered. "People disappear," he continued. "Over the years, tenants just vanish. No signs of forced entry.
No struggles.
They just go missing. And the only thing they have in common." He looked at me, his expression grim. "They all went down to the basement." I gritted my teeth. "Then why the hell is it still open?" He shook his head. "The landlord seals it, locks it, chains it up. But no matter what, the door always opens again." I felt my stomach turn. I should have left right then. Packed my things, walked away, and never looked back. But I didn't, because I knew something that my neighbor didn't. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the clock. 2:55 a.m. I gripped the baseball bat I had taken from my closet, my pulse quickening. 2:59 a.m. I forced myself to take slow, deep breaths. 3 a.m. Silence. I waited, listened, and then, knock, knock, knock. My body went rigid. It was the same as before. Slow, steady, coming from the basement door. I squeezed the bat tighter. Then, the click. The basement door unlocking on its own. And then, thump, a single heavy footstep on the stairs. Then another, and another, coming closer. I should have stayed in bed. I should have followed my neighbor's warning. But something inside me, some sick, twisted part of my mind, needed to see. I stood up and crept toward my apartment door. The hallway outside was dim, the single overhead bulb flickering. Then, a shadow moved at the end of the hall. Tall, thin, wrong. Stepped forward into the light. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long. Its neck too thin. Its fingers dragging along the floor. Its face, if it even had one, was obscured by shadows. But the worst part? It was knocking on the door across from mine. And as I watched, frozen in place, the door opened, and my neighbor was pulled inside. The door slammed shut, and the knocking started on mine. Knock, knock, knock. I couldn't move. The thing that had dragged my neighbor into his apartment was now outside my door. The air grew thick, suffocating. The overhead light flickered violently. A slow, rasping breath seeped through the cracks around the doorframe. I gripped the baseball bat in my hands, my palms slick with sweat. Then, the door handle turned. A sickening creak filled the room as the door opened just a crack. And through the gap I saw it. A single, bony hand with fingers too long, curling around the edge of the door. I choked back a scream. I threw my full weight against the door, shoving it shut and twisting the lock. My breath came in sharp gasps as I pressed my back against the wood, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, a slow, deliberate scratch against the door, fingernails dragging across the wood. I squeezed my eyes shut. Go away, go away, go away. The scratching stopped. The silence stretched on. And then, I heard the basement door open, something heavy dragging itself back down the stairs. I waited for hours before I finally worked up the courage to move. When the sun finally rose, I packed whatever I could carry and left. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't say goodbye. I just ran. Days passed. Then weeks. I found a new place, far from that cursed apartment. I tried to move on. I tried to forget. But something followed me. At night I still hear it. The knocking. Soft. Patient. Sometimes, I catch glimpses of movement in the corners of my eyes. Too tall, too thin. And last night, when I went to bed, I noticed something scratched into the wood of my bedroom door. 3 simple words. I found you. When the family in 707 suddenly moved out, no one was surprised. People left this building all the time, sometimes overnight without even taking their furniture. The landlord, Mr. Grigorov, didn't care about the reasons. He just wanted the apartment cleaned and ready for new tenants. That's how I ended up inside. I wish I had never set foot in that place. Mr. Grigorov asked me to help check the apartment. I wasn't a professional cleaner, but he knew I needed the extra cash. The door to 707 creaked as we stepped inside. At first glance, it looked normal, clean, no sign of damage. The furniture was still there, perfectly arranged as if the family had just stepped out for groceries. But something felt off. The air was stale, thick, like the apartment hadn't been touched in years. Yet, there was no dust. The walls were too white, the curtains too stiff, like everything had been wiped down, scrubbed. I stepped further inside, my skin crawling. That's when I noticed them. Tiny black cameras. Dozens of them. Hidden in the corners, embedded in the ceiling, peeking from behind bookshelves. Jesus, I muttered, looking up at Mr. Grigorov. Did you know about this? The old man frowned, stepping closer. He hadn't noticed them before either. The cameras were wired through the walls, professionally installed. I walked into the living room, my stomach twisting. Then I saw the table. A stack of photographs sat neatly arranged in the center. I picked up the first one. It was a picture of a man from the second floor, walking to his car. The next was of an elderly woman, peering out of her kitchen window. Another showed 2 kids playing in the courtyard. Dozens of photos. All of them were of people in this building. Our neighbors. Then I reached the last one. I felt my breath catch. It was me, sleeping. I dropped the stack, my hands shaking. My mind raced. Who took these? How did they get into my apartment? Mr. Grigorov was already moving, pulling drawers open, his expression darkening with every passing second. Then he stiffened. What is it? I asked. Wordlessly, he pointed at the bedroom closet. It was slightly open, and from the darkness inside, a single red recording light blinked. I took a slow step toward the closet. My pulse hammered in my ears. The camera inside was still on. I swallowed hard and reached out. A sound stopped me. A click. The unmistakable sound of a door unlocking. But it wasn't the front door. It was the closet. And inside, something moved. The closet door creaked open. Slowly, inch by inch. I took a step back, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. Something shifted inside. Then, a hand shot out, pale, thin. Fingers stretched unnaturally long, curling around the doorframe. I choked back a scream. Mr. Grigorov reacted faster than I did. He grabbed my arm and yanked me backward. The closet door swung open completely. Inside, the shadows moved. And from the darkness, a figure stepped out. He was tall, too tall. His back was hunched. His skin stretched tight over sharp bones. He wore clothes that didn't fit. A wrinkled suit, too loose, like he had stolen it from someone else. But his face, it was wrong. His skin was sickly pale, almost translucent. His eyes, they weren't human. Too wide, too black, and they were locked directly on me. Mr. Grigorov grabbed my wrist. "We're leaving. Now." The man tilted his head at the sound of his voice, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled the wrong way. Then, he stepped forward. Fast. Too fast. We ran. Mr. Grigorov shoved me through the doorway, nearly knocking me over. We tumbled into the hall, gasping for breath. He slammed the apartment door behind us. Silence. I turned, my pulse hammering. What the hell was? Bang! A single, heavy pound on the door from the other side. Then another, and another, louder, faster, angrier. Then, it stopped. We didn't move. We barely breathed. Then something happened that made my blood run cold. The doorknob turned. Slowly, deliberately. The door was still locked, but the knob kept twisting. Mr. Grigorov grabbed my arm and dragged me down the hallway. We didn't stop running until we were outside, the cold night air hitting my skin like a slap. I turned back to look at the building, at the window to 707. The lights were off, but I could still see him, standing there, watching me, smiling. We never went back inside. Not that night. Not ever. The next morning, Mr. Grigorov had the apartment sealed, bolted shut. No new tenants.
No explanations.
Just a quiet, unspoken agreement. No one enters 707. But something still haunts me. I've been sleeping with my lights on, checking my locks 3 times, ignoring the feeling that something is watching me. And then, last night I woke up and found a camera sitting on my bedside table, recording. I wasn't alone. I stared at the camera on my bedside table, my chest tightening with fear. It was small, black, and blinking red. Recording. I scrambled back, my breath coming in sharp gasps. My mind raced. How did it get here? Who put it here? I grabbed it with shaking hands and hit the playback button. The screen flickered to life. The video showed me, sleeping. My body stiffened as I watched myself, chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. Then, at exactly 3:07 a.m., the camera shook. The screen glitched, the static hissing. And then, a shadow. Something stepped into the frame. Tall, thin. It stood beside my bed, watching me. Something is here. I dropped the camera as if it had burned me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 3:06 a.m. My stomach twisted. 1 minute. I turned on every light in my apartment, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip my phone. I didn't want to watch, but I had to. The seconds ticked by. 3:07 a.m. I held my breath. Silence. Nothing moved. I exhaled shakily, running a hand over my face. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the video was old. Then, a floorboard creaked. Right behind me. I froze. The air in the room shifted, thick, heavy, wrong. A cold breath crawled across the back of my neck. I turned slowly and saw the closet door. It was open, and from the darkness inside, 2 wide, black eyes were staring at me. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't grab my things. I just ran. Out of my apartment, down the stairs, into the freezing night. But as I stepped outside, I stopped, because across the street, from the window of apartment 707, he was standing there, watching me, and this time, he wasn't alone. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. From the window of 707, the man with the hollow eyes stood motionless. And behind him, more figures, tall, thin, motionless, all of them watching me. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. Then, the front door of my apartment building creaked open. I snapped my head around. It was still dark inside, still waiting. Something shifted in the shadows just beyond the doorway. And then, a footstep, slow, deliberate, coming toward me. I turned and ran. I didn't stop. Not when I reached the street. Not when I passed rows of dark, silent buildings. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out beneath me. I didn't stop until I reached a hotel on the other side of the city. I paid in cash, locked the door, kept every light on. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling, like something had followed me. The night stretched on, endless and suffocating. My body ached with exhaustion, but I couldn't sleep. And then, just as the clock ticked past 3:07 a.m., my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. Then finally I opened it. There was no text.
No explanation.
Just an image. A photo of me, sitting on the edge of the hotel bed. My blood turned to ice. I was alone. I hadn't taken this picture. And then, the closet door in my hotel room creaked open. Sasha first heard the digging on his second night in the house. It started just after midnight. A slow, rhythmic scrape-shove thud of a shovel cutting into the earth. First, he ignored it. People had strange habits. Maybe his neighbor was a gardener. Maybe he had some weird hobby. But when it happened again the next night, and the night after that, Sasha couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The man in the yard. The digging always started at exactly 12:15 a.m. Sasha would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening as the shovel bit into the soil over and over again. He decided to check. Pulling on a jacket, he stepped outside into the cold night air. His neighbor's yard was dimly lit by a single flickering porch light. And there, in the middle of the yard, was the man. Tall, thin, moving with slow, mechanical precision. Digging. Sasha swallowed hard. The man hadn't planted anything.
No flower beds.
No trees. No grass disturbed except for that one spot. A patch of freshly dug earth. The same spot. Every night. The man stopped. The shovel froze in place. And then, without turning around, he said, "Go back inside. Something's missing." Sasha didn't sleep. The next morning, as soon as the sun rose, he went back outside. The yard was pristine.
No luose dirt.
No signs of digging. As if the hole had never existed. But something was missing. A shed. There had been an old, rotting shed standing in the yard the day Sasha moved in. He was sure of it. Now it was gone. The ground where it had been was smooth, freshly covered. Sasha's stomach twisted. What the hell was his neighbor burying? The disappearance. That night, Sasha waited by the window. 12:15 a.m. The digging started. But this time something was different. The rhythm was off. Uneven. Like someone was struggling. A muffled groan broke through the still night air. Sasha's blood ran cold. He grabbed his phone and dialed his neighbor's number. No answer. He tried again. Still nothing. Then, the digging stopped. The night fell silent. A chill crept up Sasha's spine. He strained his eyes, peering into the darkness. His neighbor was gone. The yard was empty. But just as he turned away from the window, the digging started again. This time, coming from beneath the ground. Sasha's breath caught in his throat. The digging hadn't stopped. It had just moved. The sound no longer came from the yard. Came from beneath it. Scrape, shove, thud, like someone was trapped underground. Sasha's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. He called his neighbor again. No answer. He tried one last time. This time, the call connected. But there was no voice on the other end.
No breathing.
Just the sound of dirt being shoveled. The yard. Sasha wasn't stupid. Every instinct screamed at him to stay inside. But something about that sound, about the way the digging had changed, made his stomach twist with dread. He had to check. Grabbing a flashlight, he stepped into the cold night air. The wind had died. The whole neighborhood felt too quiet. He pointed the beam toward his neighbor's yard. The dirt looked wrong. Loose. Uneven. Like something had crawled through it. Sasha swallowed hard. "Mr. Morozov?" he called, his voice unsteady. No answer. Just silence. And then, a hand shot out of the dirt. "Something's coming up." Sasha staggered back, his heart slamming against his ribs. The hand was thin, trembling, covered in soil, clawed at the earth frantically, pulling. A second hand emerged. Then a face. His neighbor's face. Pale. Sunken. Terrified. His mouth opened. Sasha. No sound came out. And then, something grabbed him. A blackened hand shot up from beneath him, wrapping around his throat. His neighbor's eyes bulged in pure horror. He thrashed, kicked, but whatever was beneath the dirt was stronger. It yanked him down. Sasha lunged forward, grabbing his neighbor's arm. "Hold on," he gasped. The grip was ice cold. Then, Sasha saw them. The other hands. Dozens of rotting fingers pushing up from the earth, grabbing onto Mr. Morozov's legs, his arms, his chest, pulling him deeper. Sasha let go. For a split second, their eyes met. His neighbor wasn't just scared. He looked relieved. Then the earth swallowed him whole, and the yard fell silent. The next night, Sasha didn't sleep. He spent the morning waiting for someone to notice, someone to ask about the missing man. No one did. By evening, a single police car showed up. They stayed for 15 minutes. Then they left. No news. No investigation. No questions. As if it had happened before. That night, at 12:15 a.m., Sasha sat by the window and listened. The yard was still. Empty. For the first time in weeks, there was no digging. And then, he heard the shovel. Coming from his own backyard. Sasha's blood ran cold. The digging had moved. To his own yard. Scrape. Shove. Thud. The rhythmic sound sent a shiver down his spine. He didn't move. Didn't breathe. This wasn't just somebody digging. Something was coming closer. A shadow in the yard. Sasha forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady. Slowly, he crept toward the window, heart hammering in his chest. Outside, in the dim glow of the street lamp, something moved in his yard. A shadowy figure. Tall. Thin. Digging. Sasha swallowed hard. His mind screamed at him to turn away, to pretend he never heard it. But instead, he reached for the back door and stepped outside. The air was still, heavy. The figure didn't react. Sasha's voice came out hoarse. What are you doing?" The figure stopped digging. For a long moment it just stood there. Then slowly, turned. The moonlight hit its face. Sasha's stomach lurched. Because it wasn't a stranger. It was his neighbor, Mr. Morozov. The same man he had watched get pulled underground. His face was pale, stretched, wrong. His eyes, deep, sunken pits of nothing. And in his hands he still gripped the shovel. A slow, cold smile spread across his lips. "You should start digging," he whispered. The final warning. Sasha stumbled back, his pulse hammering. "No," he croaked. You're dead. I saw you." The thing wearing Mr. Morozov's face took a step closer. And another. "Start digging," it whispered again. Sasha turned and ran. He bolted into the house, locking the door behind him. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. Through the window he could still see him, standing there, smiling, waiting. And then, he started digging again, this time closer to the house. The last night, Sasha didn't sleep. By morning, the yard was undisturbed. No sign of digging. No sign of his neighbor. But Sasha knew. It wasn't over. That night he packed a bag. He was leaving. For good. But just as he was about to step out, a noise stopped him. Not knocking. Not digging. Something else. Something inside the house. Sasha turned, his breath catching in his throat. The closet door at the end of the hall was slightly open. And from the darkness inside, a shovel leaned against the wall, waiting for him. When Vika moved into her new apartment, she thought she had found the perfect place. It was quiet, affordable, and freshly renovated. But there was one thing she couldn't ignore. Every night, at exactly 3:12 a.m., she heard it. Breathing. Not from outside. Not from the hallway. From inside the wall. The first night. First, She thought it was just her imagination. She had barely unpacked, still getting used to the creaks and groans of the old building. But as she lay in bed that night, her ears strained against the silence. And there it was, a slow, shallow inhale, then an equally slow, rasping exhale. Right behind her bedroom wall, Vika's stomach twisted. She held her breath, waiting. Silence. Maybe she was imagining it. She turned over, pulling the blanket tighter around her. Then, the breathing started again. Closer this time. The repairman. The next morning, Vika called her landlord. "I think there's something in the walls," she said. "A rat, maybe?" The landlord sent 2 repairmen that afternoon. They knocked on the wall, listening for movement. One of them frowned. "There's space back here," he muttered. "What kind of space?" Vika asked. He exchanged a glance with his coworker. "Not sure," he said. "We'll check." They removed a section of the wooden paneling. Dust and debris spilled onto the floor. Behind it was a narrow passage, a hidden space running between the apartments. Vika's skin prickled. The passage was dark, the air inside stale. Something shifted in the shadows. The repairman aimed his flashlight inside. And that's when they saw it. The mattress. An old, filthy mattress was wedged against the wall. Beside it, dirty clothes, a pile of discarded food wrappers, and deep scratches along the wooden beams, like fingernails had been dragged down them. The repairman exhaled sharply. "Someone's been living here." Vika's stomach turned. She stepped closer, peering into the darkness. And that's when she saw the eyes. 2 wide, unblinking eyes, staring right at her. The man behind the wall. The figure lunged. Vika screamed, stumbling backward. The repairmen cursed, scrambling for their tools. But before anyone could react, the thing in the wall was gone. It moved too fast. A blur of limbs and shadows, disappearing deeper into the hidden passage. The men quickly sealed the hole, hammering the paneling back into place. But it didn't matter. Vika knew. He was still in there, watching, waiting. And later that night, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the breathing returned. This time right against the wood, right beside her bed. Vika didn't sleep. She lay frozen in bed, listening to the slow, steady breathing coming from behind the wall. Every inhale, every exhale was too close, right against the wooden paneling. She squeezed her eyes shut, gripping the blanket so tightly her fingers ached. Then, a soft tap. She jerked upright. The sound came from inside the wall.
Top. Top. Top.
Rhythmic, intentional, like someone was knocking back. A terrible realization. The next morning, Vika went straight to her landlord. "There's someone in the walls," she whispered. "I saw him." The old man's face paled, but he didn't look surprised. Instead, he sighed heavily and rubbed his temples. "Apartment 4B?" he muttered. Vika nodded. He looked away. "You should move out." Her stomach dropped. "You knew?" she whispered. "You knew someone was in there?" The landlord hesitated. Then, quietly, he said, "He's always been there." Vika felt the blood drain from her face. "What do you mean?" she demanded. The landlord exhaled. "Years ago, before the renovations, the original owner had a son. He was sick, violent. The family kept him locked away. But when they moved, they just left him there." Vika's chest tightened. "They searched," the landlord continued. "The police, the neighbors. But no one found him." He rubbed his face. "They assumed he disappeared." Vika's breath came in short gasps. "But he didn't." The landlord shook his head. "No," he murmured. "He's still here. And now he knows about you. The scratches." That night, Vika didn't turn off the lights. She double-locked the door, placed a chair against the handle, and sat awake, waiting. For the first few hours, there was nothing.
No breathing. No tapping.
No movement. Then, just as she started to relax, a slow, dragging sound. A fingernail against wood. Scrape. Then another. Scrape. Scrape. Vika's throat went dry. Her eyes darted to the wall. The sound wasn't coming from the passage anymore. It was coming from inside her apartment. She turned her head, her breath catching. The closet door was open, and from the darkness inside, she saw him, Vika's body locked up. The closet door stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness. But she knew he was in there. She could feel it. The same slow, ragged breathing. The same suffocating, watchful presence. Her mind screamed at her to run, but she couldn't. She was trapped. Something. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Then, a slow creak. The closet door moved. Vika's breath hitched. She gripped her phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness and landed on him. A thin, pale figure crouched in the shadows. Sunken eyes, stretched skin, filthy clothes that hung off his bony frame. His head tilted sharply. And then, for the first time, he spoke. "You!" His voice was hoarse, dry, and used. "Can hear me." The crawl space. Vika lunged for the door. She yanked it open, ran, and nearly tripped over herself as she bolted into the hallway. She didn't stop running. Didn't look back. Not until she was standing in front of her landlord's door, banging desperately. When he finally opened it, his face went white. "He's in my apartment," Vika gasped. The landlord didn't speak, didn't ask questions. He just grabbed his keys and marched toward B. The hidden path. The apartment was silent, but the closet door was wide open. The landlord stepped forward, pulling at the old wooden paneling inside, and beneath it, a hidden crawl space, a passage that led through the walls. The landlord swallowed hard. "I'll call someone," but Vika was already gone. She never spent another night there. The final night. Days passed. Weeks. Vika found a new apartment, a new life. She tried to forget. But one night, as she lay in bed, half asleep, she heard it. A slow, steady breath. Not outside. Not in the hall. Behind the wall. And then,
Top. Top. Top.
"You can hear me."